Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about one of the newest projects from Taxon called Doraemon. Alright, it's been a minute since I've talked about this guy, Taxon, the ever-prolific, obscure-ish Bandcamp artist whose actual obscurity seems to lessen every time I've covered him in video form. I've done 3 previous videos on various albums of his that seemed most relevant to the stuff I usually cover on this channel. Guy currently has 38 releases out, and the one I'm covering here isn't even his most recent. This is just one that I heard once and felt like, yeah, I think this one's video material. But it took a while to actually get to making this video. Oh well. So as I think I've established in my previous videos, as prolific as his work is, and as someone who's managed to sit through all of his releases at least once each, he's not the most consistent artist I've ever covered. I don't think there's gonna be many people who like every single thing he's ever released. But there's so much stylistic variety between all his releases that I feel like everyone will at least be able to find a handful that they really like. And everyone is gonna have different picks for which ones they actually like. And he has really managed to form a very strong and well-defined artistic identity as well. In spite of how different his stuff can be, I will very easily be able to recognize an Taxon project from a distance. Even if it's up in the air how much I will actually enjoy any given project, he's consistently at least interesting, and he is absolutely the kind of artist that I feel like the music world needs more of. So okay, time for the In Brief segment, catching up on all the stuff he's released since my last video on him, that was two-tone, and he's put out 9 more projects including this one, so here's my thoughts on those. This EP is where he decided that straight chiptune can be good. And this EP was good. Don't really have anything else to say about it. Okay, indie bedroom pop album that switches off being playful and peppy with being genuine and heartfelt, with lyrics that are very overtly gay and communist to the surprise of no one who's been paying attention to him for long enough. Very much the kind of thing that only he would make. Not precisely a high-stakes or high-tension album, but pretty dang solid. It's another ambient album meant to be the nighttime companion to Cicada, I suppose. Well, to me it probably more resembles his attempts at synthwave on Traveler than it does to his other previous ambient outings, but whatever, still pretty nice listen. Okay, so this is his take on modern dubstep, inspired by artists like Virtual Riot and Must Die. And it is a lot more polished and professional sounding than I would have expected. While some melodic tones that feel directly pulled from two-tone are still recognizably his, the drops do really sound like the kind of thing that would come out of a more mainstream producer in this genre. And the presence of singer Lou on the track Nothing Is Lost, she sounds like she's like a real professionally trained vocalist herself, not the kind of voice I would expect on an Taxon release at all. Really caught me off guard. That said, I wouldn't say I loved this thing either. Like, there's a lot of tracks on here where, like, the transitions between the build-up and drop sections are just typically non-existent, as this genre can do sometimes. It often feels like we're switching between an Taxon production and someone else entirely within any given track. Not to mention, I think the songs themselves are not nearly as strong or memorable as those on two-tone. Really, the only one that felt like a big keeper to me was the title track. That one was good. And other tracks, while I like parts of all of them, they just still have elements that pull me out. Like Ordeal Day it could have been like some flashy Diamond Sky-ish pop tune, but the dubstep elements made it feel all brittle and hollow in a bunch of parts and ended up kind of falling flat. I mean, this album's definitely a fun experiment. It's cool to see him at his most professional and mainstream sounding, but the final result is like the least Taxon sounding Taxon project I think I've heard so far. I mean, it's not bad, but I'll stick to two-tone. So this album shows him at his darkest and edgiest, making rough and aggressive, lo-fi, post-industrial noise pop. Didn't really go into this expecting to like it much, given how I wasn't really huge on the art state, which has some stuff in common with this. But I did like it a lot more than I would have expected. All the hyper noisy and fuzzy and rough production here helps sell all the dark and turbulent emotions on display here. Don't know if I'm gonna put it on that often in the future, but it's pretty good. I liked it. Here's another one I did not anticipate enjoying nearly as much as I did. Like, I wasn't huge on punk, and this album is like a Plunderphonics mashup release very much in the same vein as that. albeit less political and more jokey. But I don't know, I just had a lot more fun with this one for whatever reason. The guy managed to sample Imagine Dragons' Believer and get me to actually enjoy it by some miracle, so big props for that alone. Oh, and the track Mr. Puth Breathes 3 Times Before I Drop the Bass, especially, that one went so hard, my god, that was great. Thumbs up on this overall. Okay, this came out after the album I'm reviewing now, but whatever. It's another ambient project, but this one's like a mix of his telecommunications and nostalgia albums from last year. Very lo-fi vibe, and it's entirely in mono as well. Still like those albums more personally, but this was really nice too. It's also one of his most depressing releases in a while. And this is his soundtrack to Quentin Review's Garfield fan film. Works better in the context of that fan film than it does by itself, as you might expect, but it's cute, it's nice. Which brings us to here. So yeah, obviously Doraemon isn't his most recent project anymore, but it is one that I felt needed to be covered in video form. This one, right from the outset, just felt like it was a really important moment for him. It felt like a culmination of several different albums he'd put out. It was an album that he pretty clearly spent more time and effort into than he usually does. Certainly the one that's offered the most in the way of discussion material this year. Personal enjoyment-wise, while I don't think Doraemon quite hits the heights of previous favorites of mine could, like Winter Beats and Find My Knob and Telecommunications, this is definitely the album of his from 2019 that I've enjoyed the most, and it's a pretty great album all around. So what even is the premise of this album? Well, I mean, I suppose it comes off to me kind of as a mix of his album 16 Sketchbooks Ago and Two Tone, with super high energy and overtly happy-sounding EDM Eurodance-ish tracks, but usually with lyrics that are pretty heavy and dark. But that doesn't necessarily apply to every track on here. It kind of jumps around stylistically a lot, and is the kind of album that kind of begs to be broken down track by track. Though it also doesn't feel incohesive either. It does seem to have built up a really solid and understandable arc. Now, I will warn people that if you've never heard any Eric Taxon album before, I don't know if this is necessarily the best place to start. Well, it's not the worst place to start. I mean, this album can certainly give you a good overview of, like, the various sounds and styles that he's explored. It showcases what a versatile artist he can be. But this is also a pretty intense listen. It's probably not for the faint of heart. It's an album that often makes me pretty dang uncomfortable while I'm listening to it. However, I also understand that this is the entire point. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. Like, a few parts of this album, especially in the first half, kinda remind me of that time I tried listening to that one album by the Quick Brown Fox called Wanderlust. Now, I personally hated that album. I thought it was so ridiculously happy and overly energetic to the point of being kinda horrifying. Though in that case, I'm fairly certain that the final effect wasn't actually intentional. Here, though, it is definitely intentional. This contrast isn't shown in an obvious way right away, but it's still definitely there. Take the opener, Homeward Demon. Ridiculously fast drum and bass or nightcore level tempo. Thankfully not as headache-inducing as actual nightcore, but still pretty intense with all its sparkly melodies and crashing, buzzing synth players that seem taken out of the wavetable books, albeit not as strongly placed. Then the lyrics come in, and while they're all metaphorical and obtuse, they're all conveying this feeling of something missing, something going wrong. It's a lot to take in, but at this point, it's still pretty pleasant to listen to. That anime soundtrack sample at the very beginning is really nice, too. We're in pretty subtle territory, but as the album goes on, the contrast is intensified further. The loudest patch of grass, for instance, not super obvious either, given A, it's an instrumental, and B, the melodies are pretty unambiguously happy. But all the synth tones are super blaring and loud and grating and just totally overwhelming. This one admittedly got less and less fun to listen to with each listen. The particular synth tones on display are, like I said, pretty grating and feel like a bit much. But at least I do feel like it's using that grating quality to further the intensity of the album. Same feelings on I Started a Forest Fire Today, with a track that most sounds like it would have fit at home on 16 Sketchbooks Ago. Noisy production and a lo-fi distorted filter over his voice. The synth tones are just as blaring as the previous tracks, but the melodies and chord progressions once again are pretty cheerful sounding. Similarly, the lyrics give off that exact same contrast, like he's talking about starting a forest fire. all this mass chaos and destruction, I guess. And he's talking about how this means he's breathed life into the forest, and you can see what he's done from a mile away. That is a big yikes. I mean, it's obviously not literal. I've had a really hard time, like, pinning down in words what I think it means. I suppose he's trying to convince the sense of danger and impending doom coming from a perspective of someone who doesn't comprehend what's going on, or maybe it's something else along those lines, I don't know. I at least get what he was going for, even if I'm not 100% sure I can properly verbalize it. But you know what would help right at this point in the album? A break. So this album has two little instrumentals that, I guess, serve as a distraction from the subtly creepy subtext shown in previous tracks. You got the minute-and-a-half Moshi Moshi, which feels like it is meant to soundtrack one of those low-detail anime-style animations. Very lighthearted, cute, minimalistic. I didn't think this track added that much on first listen, but repeat visits have only helped this track feel more necessary as something to ease the tension. And then Sense, that's my favorite track in the bunch. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as it is this kind of like abstract broken beat thing that wouldn't have felt out of place on his Gallery album. Has a very lighthearted and laid back and uplifting feeling to it, but still pretty strange in his choppy manipulation of sounds. Would have likely been a big climax point on that album, but here it's an extension of the mental break, like just taking your head into a happier place. I kinda wish he'd make a whole album that sounds like this, because he can do it really dang well. Anyways, we then move on to Cold Water, where we return to that contrast shown in the earlier tracks. The instrumental does have a lot of those grating and screeching tones in many parts, but still relatively agreeable. And the lyrics show the point at which the subtext becomes text. He's tackling his internal demons, showing plenty of self-hatred. He thinks himself a traitor to himself and everyone else he's met. He thinks if he were truly happy, he wouldn't be able to trust himself. Another big yikes. This track is admittedly one that I enjoy a lot more when I'm reading the lyrics, because the lyrics are excellent, while the instrumental is a little overbearing, and the track itself can be a tad long-winded, even if it's split into two relatively distinct parts. I don't think it was ever one of my biggest favorites, but it is one that I always appreciated the presence of. Anyway, at this point in the album, it's possible that you could have ignored all the lyrics and not noticed any of the darker subtext at all. If those more grating and intense synth tones were more your thing, you'd probably not be able to see the next track coming at all. But the 10-minute failing is the point at which no one is going to be able to ignore any of the underlying themes anymore. It's the most experimental part of the album, starting out with this sample of someone like playing a piece in which the musician has to play the cello while reciting this super meta commentary about how difficult it is to recite that commentary and play the cello at the same time. Meanwhile, all these super creepy noises in the background continually build up and get louder and louder and finally pay off in one giant burst of pure harsh noise and distorted screaming. Yeah, try ignoring the subtext on that one. After this, though, the track turns into this weird, like, saucerful of secrets style experimental ambient piece, with glitchy noises that come and go and eventually transitioning into these melancholy pad progressions at the end. And while this track is admittedly a bit of a hammer on the head in terms of the album's themes, it's also one of my biggest favorites. The jump scares aren't quite as out of nowhere as, say, the one on his Paul album. They also feel a lot more earned. And I do really like the many parts this track goes through to really keep your attention, as horrifying as it can be sometimes. And the downtrodden ending is strangely comforting in a way. I like it. So that's our album's climax. Time for some resolution. The Stars in My Head is basically a sparkly and agreeable tune somewhere along the two-tone lines, but with more emotional stakes than anything else on there. This seems to show him directly addressing the themes of the album and coming to terms with his emotional state, I guess. The whole album does appear to be, like, about his living with autism and how it can make him feel like he's not in control of his own life and actions. I mean, I don't have proper autism myself, though I do have pretty bad ADD. I have gone through some depression stuff, I suppose. So I can relate to a lot of the things that he talks about on this album and understand his perspective. This track was another one of my biggest favorites, because it also helped that none of the grating synth tones from the first half of this album show up here. It's a lot smoother sounding, it plays more to my taste in his brand of synth pop. Oh yeah, and the album ends with a heavenly sounding ambient piece called A Quieter Shade of Pink. While it's not the best ambient piece I've ever heard out of him, and probably not one that this album necessarily needed, it is that little extra addition that makes this album feel like all the more important of a release in his catalog and all the bigger of an event. Because just showing the variety more, I suppose. And it is nice to close out on a calm note like that one as well. It's not like this track weighs the album down. So that's Doraemon. Overall, yeah, it's a pretty intense listen, and not one that I personally enjoy every detail on, but it's one of his most fully realized and well fleshed out releases to date, and one that I just gotta stand back and mark as a landmark release in his catalog. Not to mention, it's one of those releases that nobody else could have possibly made, not only because of how it delves into his personal experiences and darkest thoughts, but just how it explores so many facets of his style and sounds like a combination of like 8 different previous albums that somehow came together in a natural way. I don't think it's gonna have a lot for me in terms of replay value, and I'm not sure whether it'll be a year-end list contender. This album can definitely be a bit much for me, and only has like 4 or 5 choice tracks that I really enjoyed coming back to every time I put this on. But even at its worst, I still understand all the choices made and how they fit in context, and I wouldn't change any aspect of this album given the choice. So, yeah, I guess that's it. This album's pretty great, and I'm glad the world still has Eric Taxon in it, still putting out quality material like this. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Found someone to live for.